You and I had talked off camera about the $3 trillion market cap now for cryptos. I mean, to say the train has left the station is definitely a way to put it. There's no doubt the stuff is taking hold, and it is playing a role in what people are considering doing. I still look at the opportunity as an inflation hedge a little differently, because I'm still focused on the idea that in the end, as interesting and as exciting as new technology can be, I still think that people need to make sure that they secure wealth with something that's 100%. Physical and real, tangible. But you can't deny the level of participation that seems to be growing in this world.
100%. Yeah, Nate, who was just on, actually, he put a comment. Rosie Rios was the last human being to sign the $100 bill. That's what her name was on.
So that's why it sounds pretty familiar. Okay.
It's interesting. This world is getting crazy, and I actually, first and foremost, agree. The message we've always portrayed on this show is I still only play with crypto as a discretionary income. Gold and silver are my priority. They go in first because at the end of the day, in my hand, physical in my hand. And I don't want crypto jumping in unless it's actually backed. I want the gold standard back, Fred. Like that's
great.
I want it backed. I want things tokenized. I think that the future is technology, but at the end of the day, constitutional money. Before we dive into some of that, though, this world's gotten a little crazy since you were on last, regards to money. We've now passed a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill, and I remember you and I having a conversation when I was on partial vacation about infrastructure. Do you remember that conversation we were talking about?
Yeah, I do.
And I would love to go over that again, because how do you keep printing money even if you say, well, it's an infrastructure bill and we need it?
Here's the thing. Regardless of the fact that we're printing money, there are certain needs that are inevitable. If you have health problems, whether you have finances or not available, you have to address these. There are certain things you just can't get around. If you have a tree fall through the roof of your house,
right,
you've got to deal with it, whether you have the funds to do with this or not. And there are some things that the United States has been really lagging behind in addressing as a fundamental problem. Most of our highway programs date back to starting in the 1950s and 60s, during the Johnson administration. And a lot of infrastructure has not been updated and was scheduled to survive 40 or 50 years. And, needless to say, has probably managed well in the expectation of how long it would last. But we are getting to a critical issue when it comes to infrastructure. When roads and bridges are literally falling and creating a health hazard and really creating a massive problem, infrastructure is so far behind in terms of our requirements to deal with this, and it should have been addressed so long ago. To finally now step up and do this, it's costing us probably 10 times what it would have if we'd have done it 15 years ago. And unfortunately, we're facing a problem where the only way for us to finance new expenditures is to create new money. And the balance between trying to address that reality and still deal with these issues is becoming very interesting to me. How the juggling has been, persistent into a level of even redefining words. Like we've gone through inflationary pressures. The conversation I kept hearing from so many varied people in the past couple of weeks is they're beginning to notice price increases.
Yep.
And everybody's saying, wow, did you notice this has gone up and this has gone up? And just people making anecdotal references to, prices of things that they deal with on a day-to-day basis going up. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but, fundamentally it all comes down to this concept that we've allowed fiat money to flourish. And if you're going to let an economy run on fiat money, and again, for those that are, let's say, uninitiated to the concept, the idea of a stable monetary system was based on the idea that paper should not simply be printed with nothing backing it. Because if you do that and you have the ability to create more of that paper, then you're devaluing all of the existing paper. So, if you had $100,000 in a checking account when there was $1 trillion in the economy, you have the same $100,000 when there's $30 trillion in the economy. There is this perception that the money is still there in the account. there's this illusion that you have the same amount of money. And if you've earned a little interest, it might even be a little bit more. But what a lot of people don't recognize is the change in the buying power that occurs to money because of this fiat system every time the government deficit spends. And we are deficit spending at a record pace. We're not just merely deficit spending like we did in the 90s or even the early 2000s. We have leapfrogged those numbers and massively increased the supply of money in the United States to compensate for all the economic problems that have been coming up. And we could talk about those for hours. But the end result of this is the monetary expansion is greater in the last 2 years than any time in United States history. It parallels what we did in the middle of World War II, percentage-wise. And I mean, that was a world war. We don't have that kind of environment, yet we're creating as much money as we did during that period of time. And the public is feeling it. And I think that there's a disconnect between the understanding that there is more money floating around in the economy and how that changes the wealth of the average American. We have to focus on the buying power of capital, not merely the numbers of dollars that are sitting in accounts.
Right. How do you, so let's go back in time. Obviously, we have to have infrastructure. Clearly, back in 1776, it was much less infrastructure because you only had 13 colonies and things were a little bit different, less people, right? Now we have 50 states. None of them agree on really anything. It's a mixed bag. We have a $30 trillion plus debt, which doesn't include unfunded liabilities. You need infrastructure, 100%. We have to. How do you do this? How would you do it the proper way, I should say? How do you do it without taxing everybody to the death? And how do you do it and how do you keep it updated without plunging us into what we're really heading into? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. You know, there's a number of options. Some of them are less politically popular than others and, you know, make it more or less palatable. And of course, we also face a fundamental problem in the United States, which is the political issue, right? So regardless of logic and intellect that would apply to a problem that you just might say, well, here was a smart way to do it, or here's the intelligent way to go about it, we have to deal with it on a political level. So we have to get two opposing parties who don't like each other to agree to do something that, you know, neither one of them really wants to see done or empower the other party to benefit from. So not only do we have to deal with the logistic issue and the financing of it on any normal basis, we also have to somehow manipulate it so that it fits within the framework of making two opposing political parties happy, so that the one that's out of power will agree to the one in power to go ahead and move forward and do something. But in terms of ways to do this, I mean, you know, historically, there were major projects done by the United States in the course of history. Like, my favorite example is the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. So here the government spent millions and millions of dollars, but what they did is they built hydroelectric plants.
Okay.
So they created an infrastructure that not only created jobs, but created a perpetual power source and expanded the ability of many rural people to get access to cheap electricity and cheap power. And that was a very beneficial way to push forward an infrastructure bill. So in the modern day, you know, we could go ahead and build things in that sense. The smart way to do these things would be like a bonded, funded project. So for example, we want to build Road A that goes from point A to point B, and it's going to cost $100 million. So what we could do is we float a bond for $100 million. And basically that means we go to the public and said, hey, if you will give us money today, we'll apply that to building this road. We will pay you interest on the money you loan us. We will repay that interest and that loan to you by collecting some revenue from the road, maybe a toll, and then we could pay back the bill of the cost of building the roadway.
It's an exchange. It's an exchange of value.
So there's a zero net cost to the government, a zero net cost to the public, and in the end, we end up with a road, right? Well, unfortunately, they choose not to do things that way. Instead, you know, they pass bills that says Congress will authorize $1 trillion that we don't have, and we're going to go ahead and utilize that capital in, you know, small incremental, you know, 60 million is going to go to the power lines, and 100 million of it's going to go to this project on this bridge and roadway, and we deficit spend our way out of the problem because it's politically more expedient. The problem is it adds to the general cost moving forward of what the government has to bring in order to sustain itself. And the problem with fiat money is that the more the government chooses option B of a non-evening out of the political spending, in other words, instead of creating a project that pays for itself and negates itself to a zero-end nut, we end up with more debt. It creates a bigger problem for the government, and their need to draw money grows. And how do they compensate for that? Well, they come to us as the public and say, well, guess what? We're going to have to raise your taxes because we now have to pay for all of these things we don't have the funds for. And with a government that's deficit spending at an impossibly to keep up pace, and a Federal Reserve that is acting as an enabler, standing behind Congress saying, look, whatever money you want to deficit spend, we'll print it, and we'll provide the liquidity that you need. You know, again, we're going to solve that short-term problem, but we're creating a much bigger indebtedness to the public that we will pay for in one of two ways. Either it'll mean a reduction in that buying power of those dollars you're sitting on, or it'll be an increase in the taxes that you have to pay to fund these things.
And on top of that, it's not like 1.5 trillion or 3.5 trillion, which probably will be next. It's not even like that. I would even be like, okay, not perfect, but hey, 1.5 trillion goes to infrastructure. We can build this stuff up. That money didn't, I think they said like 1 or 3% went to actual infrastructure for the most part. How much money goes into their pockets from just corruption back and forth? And so now we're not just paying taxes on an actual road. We're paying money on money going into Republican and Democrats' back pockets because they have a son in this construction company or this could, like, it's insane. So it's not just debt going up, but it's our Congress people, based on constitutional law, our Congress people were not intended to go to bank on the government.
No, they weren't supposed to benefit from programs. I mean, you know, if what you're suggesting was the way it were, like, let's say Senator A has a son who's in the construction business, whose construction company mysteriously gets the benefit of a massive government spending package, and, you know, and gets the job project to go ahead and do that road work. Yeah, the graft is probably enormous. I mean, you know, even on a localized level, there are so few projects that are voluminous that somebody isn't benefiting from. You can't even imagine how much crap there is built into a $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion worth of spending. You know, and by the way, you know, I know we throw these numbers around.
They're insane numbers too.
They are insane. You know, $1 trillion is simply nuts. I mean, it's a number that wouldn't even have been in theoretical levels in the 1990s. You know, it wouldn't even have been something discussed. It would have just been so far out of reach that, you know, it would have been deemed impossible to talk about stuff that would cost $1 trillion. Now, you know, it seems like we have this acceptance of this because we just keep repeating it over and over. $1 trillion, $1 trillion. And it suddenly becomes a palatable concept. But I think we lose sense of just how vast these numbers are. You know, I keep remembering one of my favorite physicists who passed away many years ago, Richard Feynman, you know, made the offhand comment once that billions and trillions used to merely be astronomical numbers. The only time they were ever used was when you were talking about things in space because of the vast distances in the universe. They were never economic numbers.
Right.
You know, now we utilize them on a daily basis to the point where I think I've said this before as a half joke, but I wish the word trillion were harder to say. I wish it was a different word. And it wouldn't just be so easy to roll off the tongue. Maybe people would stumble a little bit more before we just simply accept the idea that we're passing $1.5 trillion new bill. You know, again, the public is going to feel the effects of this. People have been outraged lately at the cost increases of everything. And again, this is a fundamental problem with the fact that we've allowed the United States to go into this system of running a fiat monetary policy. And dangerously, we have a central bank that has been incorporating a lot of very disconcerting policies to perpetrate the problem. Because as we continue, we get farther and farther away from reality and what we're being told or what they expect or how they want us to perceive the world. And as those gaps get wider and wider, we get shocks every once in a while when something happens that reminds us of reality. You and I were talking about a number of things, and like Evergrande comes up.
Yeah. I mean, that's a thing today, even.
Right. So here's a great, example of the gap between what people thought was happening, which was wonderful growth and expansion of properties in China. The entire country is growing like crazy. They're building like crazy. They're putting up buildings and infrastructure everywhere, and people are marveling at all this. And then it turns out, well, the company that's doing all that building has been doing it on borrowed money, and suddenly now, it's got $300 billion worth of debt. It has placed so much emphasis on the ability to borrow money that now that it has to repay some of these debts, and it has not been able to do that, the entire infrastructure economy in China is subject to a problem. And it's bleeding over to even competitors of Evergrande, other companies that are not directly involved. Their bond issues are becoming so speculative that the rating agencies are changing their ratings. And this reminds me of what happened in the United States. Companies like Lehman began to falter when the bond issues that these companies put out become subject to question and people lose confidence. The entire game sort of implodes like a house of cards. I mean, right. It looks fine on the outside, but as soon as you start poking at one of those weak-ass cards, the entire thing just implodes and falls apart. And the U.S. faces this problem too, in that as we create more debt and we continue to deficit spend and we pass bills with money we don't have, we face a fundamental problem of the acceptance of the United States Treasury notes stability. And if the world loses confidence in our country's ability to repay our debt loans in the form of these bonds, we face a fundamentally huge problem that could devastate the U.S. economy. The only thing left standing is going to be those things of real tangible wealth.
So this article literally came out at 11:12 a.m. What is your opinion on how this Evergrande thing? So they're preparing bankruptcy proceedings against Evergrande because they officially defaulted. Now it says they again defaulted, but they're making a big deal of like, okay, they already defaulted a couple times. Like this is like huge because it's interest payments to international investors. What happens in your opinion on something like this?
Well, what they're talking about here is that there are bond payments that are due and interest payments that are due on these massive notes that Evergrande has borrowed money. So it has an interest payment due of, a few $100 billion, and it doesn't make the payment. That, by definition, would be a default, and that person holding the bond could then claim anything that has a tie to Evergrande as an asset against this bond purchase. So if, for example, the United States issues debt but doesn't make a payment on the interest, that by definition is a default. And what they're talking about that Evergrande is facing is it has these rollover debts that are coming up, and it has to make interest payments on a regular schedule, and it's barely be able to make the interest payments. And once in a while, it's a couple days late, and those people who are sitting on these bonds are a little bit nervous. If they don't see that there's viability in the company's ability to maintain its assets and maintain its level of debt, who wants to hold that debt? So as the confidence erodes, there's more pressure on the company to put up the money that they owe. And if they can't, and they go into default, there's going to be a lot of ripple effects. The only good news is of all the debt that Evergrande holds, which they estimate to be about $300 billion, there may be more because there's a lot of private financing that these guys do that it doesn't show up on their books. And then they do multiple corporation entities so that one corporate, bookkeeping has the debt on it and the other one doesn't, so it doesn't quite show up. So there actually could be an underlying additional amount of money that they owe. But about 19 billion of what Evergrande owes is owed by foreign investors that hold their bonds. The good news is that's not big enough to create a worldwide disaster. It's not like when Lehman fell. When Lehman fell, everybody held Lehman bonds. Everybody, every pension account, portfolio around the world, everybody held Lehman bonds because they were 130-year-old company in the United States, deemed one of the most stable in the world, the oldest banking history, family, and everybody looked at them as who could you trust more than Lehman? So when they collapsed, the bondholders suffered greatly across the world. Fortunately, Evergrande isn't that deep in the worldwide markets, but 19 billion isn't anything to sneeze at. So I think the ripple effect of this will be, not overly dramatic, but I think it's a sign. And it's a sign of what happens when this gap between playing around with false paper money and what's really happening, when the two of them merge. You get these knee-jerk reactions that can be violent. And what really troubles me is, at what point does the world look at the United States and say, we really are troubled by the rate at which you're accumulating debt, and we're worried that you're not going to be able to make your payment. Now, I've said this for years, I don't think the United States Treasury will ever default on any of its debt obligations because we have a central bank that acts as a backstop. And they will print whatever amount of money they have to make sure that the U.S. Treasury makes its obligations. So we're going to skirt the problem, and we're going to do that by affecting the public wealth. So we'll strip the value of the public wealth by printing more money, because the public is not going to catch on until the inflation numbers kick in. And look at what's happened the past couple of years. The Fed has solved this economic crisis we've been in by printing its way out of the problem. The Fed is holding $5.4 trillion worth of government bonds on its balance sheet. That's about a quarter of all the debt that's floating around is held by the Fed itself. And that's rather dangerous because, it means that we have one party that has such a vast amount of debt. And the more that we manipulate this problem, the more that we're going to find real big results that will occur as the reality kicks in. There will be ugly events that will happen within the economy from time to time that unfortunately will catch a lot of people off guard. And, I've been suggesting for a while, don't wait for one of these massive economic problems before you start trying to protect your wealth. Do something about diversifying your assets now while things are, we'll call it, relatively calm. And I think we have an opportunity for people to accumulate gold and silver coins now at a rate that allows us to do this while things are still viable and calm, and it will help people prevent this weaker paper money from infiltrating, their future and their wealth. And those people planning on retiring in the next 5 or 10 years, please don't count on a paper dollar to sustain its value. There's no way we can print trillions upon trillions upon trillions of unbacked dollars and still somehow maintain the same value and buying power. You can't.
How do you not want one of those? They're so pretty. Like they're so cool. I was telling this earlier. I was watching an interview between. Have you heard of Stansberry Research?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So they had a back-to-back that I was like, okay, something's going on here, because they've interviewed Kiyosaki. Kiyosaki's really good, gold, silver, Bitcoin. Yep. That's his world. But then they had Ron Paul, which I don't know that I've ever heard them interview Ron Paul. The woman who does it, she's great. Ron Paul was on, and then right after that, G. Edward Griffin. I was like, whoa! They had him on, and G. Edward Griffin says, he makes a comment. He talked a little crypto, but he talked gold, silver, etc., and basically shoring up your wealth and leveraging things like that. But then he said a very interesting quote. He said, it's going to crash, and the phoenix will rise from the ashes. And that's what he said, like out of his, and I'm like, whoa, what's he talking
about?
When he said
it's going to crash, was he referring to the dollar or the economy?
The dollar. Yep.
Okay.
The dollar is going to crash. Now, I didn't go deeper into it because I've never heard him use those words, but I thought it was really interesting just because obviously, I mean, his book, let's be honest, like that's the gold standard for audit and the Fed conspiracy red pill world of the dollar. I mean, if you're in this world, you at one point have heard of or read G. Edward Griffin, the creature from Jekyll Island, but he talks about like it's going down, and the way he's like the way to capture, the way to leverage or at least hold on to your wealth is you got to have these things. You got to have gold and silver. There's no way around it. Tell everybody, because we always have new people coming on, how does gold and silver protect your wealth? Like, what is the mechanism behind that? I know that's a weird question, probably.
It's not really. It's a great question because it's the fundamental difference between recognizing what is really valuable. So what defines something's value? why does a paper dollar that you and I spend, like if I owed you $20, why would you take a $20 paper note issued by the United States Treasury? You will accept that as a form of payment because two things. One, you can respend it to somebody else.
Right.
So it's a perpetual game of, let's call it musical chairs. You can hand it to the next guy, you'll hand it to the next guy, and we all readily accept this as a form of payment. The second thing that gives it value is the fact that you can pay your taxes with it. So the U.S. government has established the backdrop for the dollar, which in the end means there's an end user. You can always pay your taxes with it. Okay. But what's wrong with that paper dollar is that it changes in its relative value over time. It was never intended that that was supposed to be the case. In fact, the founding fathers went to extremes to prevent that from happening. They discussed it, they talked about it, they thought it through. They concluded that a unbacked paper note was not a viable method to run an economy. It would mean constrained on the government. They wouldn't be able to just simply print money to buy things they wanted or spend money they didn't have. They would have to bring that revenue in somehow on a legitimate basis. Now, when you look at gold and silver as coins particularly, we haven't minted a gold coin for currency in the United States since Roosevelt was president in 1933. And the reason that they are a store of value is because with that fixed supply, as that paper note that we use in today's economy continues to be inflated, it perpetually takes more of those paper notes to acquire that same physical gold coin. Years ago, when we went off the gold standard, the gold price was fixed at $35 an ounce. Now imagine today you could buy an ounce of gold for $35. It's kind of hard.
Crazy,
to think that, right? Today we're at $1,850 for.
Can I have $35 an ounce for just one day, and I'll.
Yeah. I'll load up and then we can go forward from there.
Right.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we can't go back in time and buy gold for $35 an ounce anymore. And as we continue to print more and more money, and as the government continues to deficit spend, the net result of that is we create more of these paper notes, inflating their value, forcing that price of the fixed supply commodity, that gold coin or that silver coin, perpetually higher. It's the reason that silver isn't $3.50 an ounce anymore. We crossed that barrier, and then it was $6 and $7 an ounce for a number of years. And the same thing happened that, eventually it was overtaken by the proliferation of paper, and it forced the price of that commodity higher. And if you think about it, the idea that silver is $24, $25 an ounce, even if it's not a silver coin, just silver itself at that price, where we're still mining that as a commodity. So we don't even have a fixed supply per se of let's say, just generic silver being produced, and yet its price still continues to climb. That's because the pace at which paper is being printed, it way exceeds the amount of silver that's being mined on Earth. And with the usage growing, then silver usage demand goes up, that gap gets wider and wider. I've always liked the gold and silver coins that the U.S. minted back when we were smart enough to have a standard against our dollar, because the fact that they are fixed in supply. Since 1964, they haven't made a dime, quarter, or half dollar that was minted out of silver currency. So as people acquire these, and more investors, more Americans put this away as part of their portfolio, there are less of these things readily available. So we have a shrinking supply relative to an increasing supply of paper. So what the gold and silver coins allow people to do is sustain the buying power of money that they're spending on these things today. So a good example of that is that if we go back to the last year they minted silver quarters, that was 1964. If you had a quarter in those days, you could buy a gallon of gas. That's about what you got for it. And that was the relative value of 25 cents. Today, a silver quarter is worth $6 or $7. Even with oil prices up and gas in New York at $4.70, you're still getting a gallon and a half worth of gas.
That's
for
crazy.
A quarter, silver quarter. In other words, the buying power has not only sustained itself but grown, and that's because there is that fixed supply. And as the government continues to move farther away from reality and continues to accept the notion that deficit spending is okay and carrying $30 trillion worth of debt is okay, the public needs to recognize that That may be fine for a government that has a way of creating additional money it doesn't have, but it doesn't work for the average person who can't do that. Unless you have a printing press that I don't know about, if you run out of money, you've got to earn more. You've got to borrow it, you've got to earn it, you've got to get it through interest or investment or labor. You have to put out some effort, and you have to do things to create more revenue for yourself. The U.S. government doesn't have that problem. It decides it wants to spend $1.5 trillion it doesn't have. Well, guess what? It has an enabler in the backstop in its back pocket that can just say, hey, I'll print whatever you want, which, I've always argued if there was going to be an entity that could create unlimited amounts of money, it shouldn't be limited to the Federal Reserve.
I'm going to give Congress the benefit of the doubt on this question.
You're generous. Go ahead.
I am. It goes against every fiber of my being, but I'm doing it anyway. Do you think Congress or government or the people in D.C., the ones who are supposed to be doing the work, I'm not talking about the bankers, they freaking know. Do you think they know that, for example, a quarter is not silver anymore or all silver? Do you think they know that the gold coin hasn't been minted? Do they know those details? I mean, because
I would say a large portion of them probably don't. Or if they do, they don't really understand the significance, which is a
problem, because they should know. That's basic 101. Like, they should know.
Yeah, if they understood that, then they would recognize what's wrong with the way they're doing things. The problem is that we've gotten to a desperate level. We need money. So, for example, when this COVID crisis became a pandemic and it hurt the U.S. economy, and we needed to move the economy forward, I think even those that would have understood the nature of what's wrong with just simply printing your way out of the problem would have also realized that there was no other option available at the time. We've allowed this to get so far beyond us that we don't have other choices. So it's simply a question of alleviating the result of devastation by somehow trying to control how much we print. In other words, we've given up not printing more money. So now we just simply have to battle how much additional debt do we want to carry? And can we continue to do that? And how will it affect us going forward? That's the battleground. So, there are deficit hawks out there on both parties, and everybody balks every time somebody wants to spend money. And, they will raise the issue of, oh, this isn't good for our kids and our grandchildren to start creating additional paper money to pay for everything. But in the end, they always end up defaulting to doing that because what other option do they have? Like, again, this infrastructure bill. Do we allow the bridges to collapse? Do we allow the roadways to just fall apart because we don't have the money? Or do we suck it up and simply say, well, look, we have to deal with this. We have no choice.
Yeah.
So we're simply going to print more money, and somebody down the line is going to have to figure out how to address the nature of what we've done. This is what I get to when I talk to people. I try to impart this at one concept. We're never going to be able to get Congress to get smart enough or have the guts enough to stop deficit spending. It's too easy for them to make that choice. They will continue to do this, and they will utilize that as an option more and more because every other option is becoming less viable. The public needs to recognize that is going to be the way things are and has to adjust its thinking accordingly. So I would recommend highly that if people have been hesitant to accumulate some physical wealth, look, if you could buy 100,000 turkeys today, I would say do it. You could probably do really well by Thanksgiving just having a slew of turkeys because there are shortages of everything physical and anything tangible. If a turkey could last for 20 years, it'd be a great storage of wealth.
Hey, call me crazy, but I'm convinced that there's market manipulation.
Oh, well, yeah. That goes without saying.
Why? So give everyone a little snapshot of why the spike today for both.
Well, the inflation numbers came out this morning, and again, what I'm laughing about is that they are surprising to people. I don't get that. When the Federal Reserve tells me that they're surprised by the rate of inflation, when they've been pushing a monetary policy that has been print money, and then they're shocked by the fact that it results in higher prices, I think they were thinking somehow this magically would just simply filter its way through the economy without an impact. I think that was very foolish to believe that that was possible. And it's been interesting to me how the Fed went from denying inflation at all for the last couple months to finally the numbers were so apparent. Everybody recognizes the price increases are occurring. The Fed gave up the idea that there was no inflation, said, okay, there is inflation, but we were anticipating it, and we don't think it's really a big problem because, eventually we can raise interest rates in order to deal with that. And I'll get back to that in a second because that's not as easy as it sounds. But then the Fed shifted from there's no inflation to okay, there is inflation, to then suggesting that the inflation we're seeing is just transitory. It's going to disappear on its own in no time. It's like you got a wart on your arm and you can ignore it because it's going to go away. Well, when it didn't go away after a couple of months, the Fed has now redefined the word transitory. They've literally changed the meaning of the word. This is the new game they're playing now. So there's no inflation. Okay, there is inflation. So the inflation is transitory. It's going to disappear. Okay, well, it's transitory, but it's going to be around for the next 2 years. That's not transitory.
Right.
So I think the Fed is, kidding itself. Now, the Fed normally would simply say, we can address inflation. There's a mechanism for that. You raise interest rates. You can slow down the movement of capital through an economy, and you can help control the problem that inflation creates. There is, however, an issue here, which is that the Fed has been buying debt from the U.S. Treasury, and even as of this month is still spending $120 billion a month putting money into the economy. $40 billion of that goes into mortgage-backed securities. The other $80 billion is direct purchases from the United States Treasury of debt from the U.S. Treasury in the form of bonds. And until the Fed stops making those asset purchases, there's no point in trying to raise interest rates because those two would negate themselves. If you raise interest rates but you continue to buy debt, you're still putting money into the economy at the same rate of pace. So you haven't done anything. It's like being on your gas pedal and brake pedal at the same time. The car can't do both. You're either going to accelerate or you're going to brake, but you can't hit both at the same time and expect anything to be different. So the first thing the Fed has to do is to stop its asset purchases, which it is now suggesting it will try to do. And it's accelerating the pace because I think the reality of its need to raise interest rates is becoming clearer. But before it can raise rates, it has to stop all of this nonsense of asset purchases. So the question becomes, how will the economy adjust when the Fed isn't buying debt anymore every month? If the Fed stops pumping all this money into the economy, is the economy moving forward quickly enough for that to be okay? Or will the Fed have to sustain its asset purchases one way or the other? I don't think they can walk away from this as easily as they think they can. I think they're stuck in a corner.
Yep.
I think they're going to need to raise rates faster than they think. It's going to cause them to raise rates much more quickly than they'd like to. That's going to cause some knee-jerk reactions. It'll be like, you're driving at 80 miles an hour. Instead of just slowly hitting the brake pedal, you're slamming on it every once in a while because it's just, the car's getting away from you. And I think the economy is facing the same problem. The Fed's going to have to crank rates faster than they want. That's going to cause some really knee-jerk reactions in the economy. But I think the Fed is not going to find it as easy as it expects to address what it's been doing the past couple of years. And I don't believe the Fed has any real policy to address these problems because we're working on a playbook. It doesn't exist. It's not like we've had this kind of environment before. So we're experiencing something that's very unprecedented and very uncertain. And again, in uncertain times, the best thing that one can do is to make sure that they accumulate physical wealth, because
100%.
that will sustain you no matter what they choose to do going forward. And if you have a Congress that won't stop deficit spending and a Fed that won't stop printing money, we better be addressing those issues now before the impact of that, which is the result of that is the higher prices. That's the end of what happens. First, they create the money flows to the economy. The end result of that is that you and I go to purchase goods and services, and suddenly we see price increases. And on top of that, of course, as if this weren't enough, we now have both a manufacturing and a shipping problem that is massive in the United States. And those costs of the additional trucking and shipping and unloading ships that are at the ports, all of those expenses have really not yet been felt by the consumer, and they will be. They used to talk about 3 cargo ships off the coast of Long Beach was considered a backlog. There are 82 right now sitting. And even Georgia is facing the problem on the East Coast. They can't unload the ships fast enough.
Correct.
So
Even I mean, Florida said bring them here, but I'm like, okay, that's great. You still can't unload them fast enough either.
Yep, nobody can at this point. So everything is taking longer to move. That means that people have to pay more to try to get this stuff off the ships quicker, and they have to pay more for the transportation of it. And the truckers are now in a prime position, which they haven't been for years, to say, I think we need more money. We should be paid better. We need better quality of life, and I think they deserve that. But again, these are costs that are going to be infiltrating the economy we haven't really experienced yet. So we're having inflation roll through the economy not only because of Fed policy of printing and printing and printing, and government policy of deficit spending and deficit spending, but now on top of that, we have manufacturing shortages and shipping problems. So this will be the case, I will guess, for the next 2 years, that the inflation problem we are starting to feel now will continue to be a fundamental problem in the economy for at least the next 2 years. And higher inflation causes higher gold prices and higher silver prices. So it would definitely be a financial benefit for people to accumulate gold and silver at current levels, even though they're higher than they've been in the past. They're not at their peaks by any means. And moving forward, I can only see silver prices and gold prices continually going higher.
So I want to look at breaking point here then, because, and I am no financial historian, I'm just looking at it from a normie standpoint and what I've researched, right? So, okay, I go to get a turkey. Now we eat some organic turkeys, right? So our turkey went from $4.99 a pound to $7.99 a pound,
Wow.
right? Basically almost double the price. Now, you have people out there who, not a big deal, right? No one wants to pay more, but like, okay, it is what it is. However, as I drive along and see people, I see people who are, in beat up cars. I see people who are walking and taking the bus, etc. And I know that they're not making as much as some upper class people are making. They're also getting hit by this. Maybe it's not a turkey, but maybe it's, their cigarettes or, the soda or whatever it is. At what point? Because the way I look at this is, and you just said a couple years, I get that. But at what point do people start, because if inflation goes up, that also means business costs go up. Mm-hmm. That also means that sometimes employees aren't hired. That means that also sometimes employees are let go, which means people can't afford anything because now they're let go. You have to have a breaking point, but the problem with the breaking point is it's not really the inflation. It is, but it's not. It's the money supply is run by the Fed. Like, where is the break? Does that make sense where the breaking point is?
Yeah, well, what's starting to happen is that you get wage pressure problems, right? So how long ago was it that we were talking about, the minimum wage was $7.50 an hour? And, that had been the case for a few years, and nobody was really squeaking about, there was always those that said it needed to be higher. Suddenly now we're talking about $12, $15 an hour wages. That's 100% increase in a matter of a couple of years. And again, this is the kind of thing that has to occur for an average person to try to keep pace. Now, what if you're in a job that the business can't afford to double your wages?
Right.
They can't afford to pay you $15 an hour. Then exactly what you said begins to happen. Those people either don't have work and have now no income at all, or that company is forced to say, we have a higher expense now in our employees. We can't get around it. They can't live on $7, $8, $9 an hour. If they've got to be paid 12 or 15, and that additional cost is coming to us, well, guess what, Mr. Consumer, you're now going to have to pay for that one way or the other. So that means cost increases across the board. And it is a cycle, it's sort of like a snowball effect. So, I need more money because I can't afford to buy the turkey. I need higher wages. I get higher wages. Now the company has to raise the price because it has to now compensate for the fact it's paying out more wages, which means it has to pay more taxes as well. And these tax implications could be huge for companies. And, it's a problem that it's hard for people to keep pace. It's very hard for an average person in an average environment to keep pace with the rate of inflation. Inflation, unfortunately, sort of really impacts the average consumer and lower wealth people much more than people of high wealth value. I mean, those people, like you said, people that are making larger amounts of money won't really complain so much about the $4 turkey now being $7.
Right.
They'll suck it up, buy it, and yeah, they'll complain about it, but it's not going to, make a difference in their Thanksgiving feasts. But for those people that are, making ends meet and living hand to mouth, and it's week to week, they earn what they do each week and they spend pretty much what they earn. How are they going to continue to manage this, especially when the government starts putting more pressure on these same people by raising their taxes? Because again, as the government deficit spends, somehow they have to compensate for that gap. And their way to do that is to look to us as the public and either strip the value of our money through inflation or raise more revenue for themselves by increasing taxes. And, I know that when they propose these $1.5 trillion bills, they always talk about, well, they'll pay for themselves because we'll raise taxes on the rich, or we'll raise taxes on this group or that group or somebody to cover it. And that rarely ever works. I mean, it never seems to be enough. You can only take so much money from the wealthy until, you're going to get people that eventually will say, okay, enough is enough. During the Lincoln administration, if you would have told people in the 1860s that at one point the United States government's going to take 40% of your income in one form or another of taxes, I mean, there would have been a revolution
100%.
before the day would have been over.
They would have cut their heads off for that one.
Right, nobody would have believed it. No one would have believed that the public would accept that. We would have been deemed slaves. The abject slavery is at the point at which you are working so much for your government that you have no money left for yourself. And 2 generations ago, one person working in a family was enough to not only take care, put food on the table, put a roof over your head, take care of the education of your kids. You could probably even put away a little bit of savings and end up figuring out a nice, simple retirement plan. One person's income could do all of that. Now we need 2 people working in an average family because one person's income has to pay all the taxes.
Yep.
Almost 100% of one person's income has to just go to cover what the government needs from us. Then the other person's income can be used for the same general expenses of the family. But if those expenses keep going up, eventually that one person's income isn't enough. Now you need 2.5 people working in a family. And for those people that don't have 2.5 people within their family that can work, the gap between what they're bringing in and what they need gets wider and wider until more people begin to fall down from that average American, let's say, lifestyle till they begin to cross into the poverty level because they simply can't make enough money to cover their bills. And the problem is the needs of the federal government keep growing. And again, we are their source. They look to the public and say, well, we could always squeeze a little bit more out of Dr. Dean and, get his business to pay a little bit more in taxes because, hey, we
trust
need
me,
the money.
They do. They do. Now, we've talked a couple times. I'm curious about this before we go. You talked about, I said, hey, is it possible? This is how my radical brain works, so bear with me. Is it possible that we could slide somehow into a crypto gold-backed currency role while still keeping the U.S. dollar? And I know, obviously, we've never been here before, so it's hard. And you said it's possible. Anything's possible, but there is no mechanism necessarily of how that would occur. So my question, I guess, is not the mechanism, because we're still trying to understand that, but there is so much liquidity building into this new world over on the side. I mean, we were joking earlier when I was with Nate that, like, I think it was CBS News or Drone Wars or something like that on TV was being sponsored by Algorand, which is a crypto. The UFC, Ultimate Fighting with Dana White, big, massive company, they're now being sponsored by Crypto.com. Like, it's getting out there. Is there a way to save this thing by somehow sliding into, because liquidity is growing big, like $3 trillion is a lot of money.
Right.
Is there a way to do that? I mean, This is brand new, so I'm just asking you theory.
Here's the thing. What's interesting is that why are we even having this conversation, right? Why is crypto even remotely interesting to
Because
me?
people are waking up.
So you got two things going here. One, of course, obviously, it's the technology. Okay, so people are fascinated. Technology has a way of sort of moving forward, whether people like it or not. I mean, you go back to the days where this is the anniversary today, actually, in the 1950s, of the first time that a person could make a long-distance phone call without the operator in the middle.
No.
Like my grandparents, when they made a long-distance phone call, you called an AT&T operator. And you said, I need to place a call to, someplace out, wherever. And they would connect you. And it was like you needed that physical operator to take a plug out of a board and jam it into another, and that's the way technology worked. So we've come from that to where we are now. And obviously there have been some huge benefits in a lot of the technology. Look at what we're able to do here. This communication method, right, would not even have existed 15 years ago. And look at how relatively easy it is now for us to be able to do this. So what interests me is that there's so much interest in these alternative currencies. I think that is a kind of an interesting way of looking at the problem with the dollar. In other words, if the dollar were really great and strong and stable, why would people be interested in as much in an alternative? Again, except for the interest in the technology and the speculation of what might happen in the future, and the fact that people want to get into the new thing early, and maybe that works out very well for them going forward. But I think it's a sort of a treatise on the reality of what's wrong with paper money.
Right.
That people are looking for an alternative. Now, can we fix the problem with a gold-backed crypto? I don't think so, because I think the problem still would exist in one way or the other. There's still that fixed supply of gold out there. And if you're going to try to attach a gold standard against something, it's going to create an interesting issue, is that it won't be able to expand without that supply being able to be matched. So how will that work? And will that work? I wonder whether or not we could work on a U.S. dollar that would go back again. People have suggested this. It got a lot of traction again when Judy Shelton was proposed to be a Fed person, and she had raised the issue of the fact that she was an advent of the idea of the gold standard.
So is Rand. Rand Paul came out and said,
because
he's behind it. He said he's behind a crypto-backed dollar.
Sure. I mean, anything that could control the rate at which dollars were expanded would be a benefit. I don't believe that the government could sustain itself, though, with any kind of constraint. This is the reason I don't believe it's going to happen.
I understand that.
Right? So it's not a technological problem that I have with it, and it's not even a fundamental problem that I have with it. I get the idea.
It's a greed problem.
Sure, it's a greed problem, right? Can I maintain my lifestyle if suddenly you're going to tell me that I can't borrow unlimited amounts of money whenever I need it?
Right.
I don't think the government could do it. I don't think they can do it. I think that reality of being capped would be the same ridiculous nonsense as this debt limit nonsense we go through, right? So we had the debt ceiling come up last month, and we didn't solve it. We pushed it back to December.
Right.
So we still face the problem where the government says, okay, we know we're just printing money, but somehow we're going to say to ourselves, well, we don't want to just keep printing money at an unlimited pace, so we're going to set a limit. And if we ever get to that limit, we're going to stop. That'll be the point at which we don't spend anymore, and at that point, we're going to somehow figure out how to maintain current levels of income and spending and somehow make them work. And then we hit that limit, and what happens? Well, the government tries to do it for about 20 hours, and then barely a day. And then they come back and say, well, this isn't going to work, so we can't keep this up. We have to raise the debt limit. So we said we weren't going to spend more than X. We've now hit that. We're going to go X plus 10 because, we have to. And I think that would be the same fundamental problem, no matter what we try to use to, put against the U.S. dollar to curtail the rate at which it's being created. I just don't see that the government would sustain itself under those circumstances. So I don't know. I don't know. I would love to see anything that prevented the government from spending more money than it takes in.
The real solution
have to be on a balanced budget basis, but it's just unrealistic.
The real solution is replace everybody in Congress, and then what you do is you go to uscoincapital.com and you buy numismatic gold and silver and, hey, maybe some copper and some other cool stuff, coins, and you actually just preserve your wealth. Fred, where they find you at US Coin Capital, capital with a CAPITOL.com. Before we leave, what is your phone number so people can reach out to you?
Yes, our phone number is 800-878-COIN. 878-2646. And, you know, I will say this to people. I really believe that watching the way numismatic coins have performed the past few years and the value of gold and silver increasing. I mean, I watched one of the rarest, in fact, the rarest of U.S. coins. I've watched this thing sell 3 times in my career. The first time for $4 million, the second time for $12 million, and then most recently, a couple months ago, $19.5 million was paid for a single $20 gold coin minted in 1933.
What's it called?
It is called a $20 St. Gaudens. It's
what?
the 1933, the last year that they were minted, where all of them were supposed to have been melted by the Treasury and never meant to go into circulation. But through a series of events, a handful of these things escaped, and the finest example known came up for sale at auction a couple times and has been resold. And you know, when I first started in the industry, again, it's been 38 years, they told us there would never be a coin that would break through $1 million, that you know, we'd never see anybody pay $1 million for a coin. There are now 300 coins that have cracked the $1 million barrier, more than a dozen that are worth more than $10 million.
Is that
and
it?
Again, the highest price paid now, that's the coin right there. That date of 1933 specifically, again, $19.5 million for that coin.
God.
So, you know, this is just the way things grow. I mean, I was offered a $2.50 gold coin today, you know, kind of a common $2.50 gold piece, but it was an MS-68. It was the finest grade anybody's ever seen. Somehow this thing survived in nearly flawless condition. And it was up to, you know, almost $10,000. You know, it's just incredible that these kinds of prices are being paid left and right for coins. People are gobbling them up as fast as they can get them, you know, because those that are wealthy, you know, they look at it like they would a piece of art.
Yeah.
And how they grow in value over the years. It's a great way to see great performance history. And fortunately for the average American, you don't need to pay $19.5 million to get rare coins. I mean, there are some really viable alternatives that are under $3,000 to $5,000. Even for real rarity, between $10,000 and $15,000, I think people would be stunned at how rare some of the coins are that they could still accumulate in today's world. And then for those that like more, let's call it generic items, there are still silver coins that are closely priced to merely the metal content. And I should point out, by the way, that that little value that these coins have above metal value was very small even a year and a half ago, and it has been creeping up and creeping up. This year, we've already had 5 price increases on the premium over melt for the average dime, quarter, and half dollar. Those people that bought in 2020 and early 2021, not only has the price of silver gone up, but the premium value over melt that they bought has also seen an increase. And this is the distinct advantage in owning silver coins that were minted by the government, since they can't make any more after 1964 when they stopped production. That opportunity is that that premium can continue to become a bigger and bigger part of their value as the demand is just accelerating beyond available supplies. Some of the largest dealers in this industry are accumulating massive quantities of pre-64 coins. They've never done that before. They're out there making purchases, they're running tape, as we used to call it, that they're buying. They want bags of silver all day long. They're trying to buy as much as they can. And we're finding that the demand is so strong right now that we've had many gaps this year of the most commonly available product has been hard to get. And I can understand if a $19.5 million coin can't be found. You know, if you came into $20 million and said you wanted to buy that coin, okay, there is only one. So if that kind of coin's not available, I get it. But silver dimes and silver quarters and silver half dollars, this is the most, you know, prolific product in this industry. It is the most generically available thing out there. We're still talking about under $3 for a dime.
Right.
And yet There are problems getting these things in quantity so many times this year that I've had a shift between, I only have quarters today, or I only have dimes today, or I only have half dollars. I don't always have all three available, and that has never been an issue. But I'm watching a lot of dealers that are doing things I've never seen before, making massive purchases of this type of generic inventory and selling it out so quickly that within a week they're back out there buying again. And it's very interesting to me to watch.
Unreal. Very, very fascinating. Fred, always thank you for your experience and your knowledge. We appreciate it. If you need to get a hold of them, uscoincapital.com. You see it on the screen. And one more time, the phone number, Fred?
800-878-2646. Anybody who calls, also please mention that you heard us on Dr. Dean's show. We always have a few hidden specials or price deals that are available. We had an interesting little special we sent out to everybody on your email list just recently. They sold out really quickly, which I wasn't surprised, but so those things are not available. But we do have interesting stuff always available, and I always keep a few little things readily available for those that catch your shows.
Nice. I love it. Fantastic. Sir, I thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. And as we head out today, as always, do me a favor. I'll say this while Fred's on the air. No matter what happens in this world, love, serve, and help your neighbor. Help humanity. Help America. Make it a happy place out there. And we will figure out how to survive and make this country great again, just like that flag that he has in his background. That's your best. I love your little studio.
Thank you. We try to upgrade a little bit. New camera, new microphone, backdrop. I'm hoping it sounds
it's fantastic.
A lot better.
No,
so yeah,
it's great.
We try to make a few improvements over the years. And I will leave you with this last thought. I've been at this industry for 38 years. One thing I've really believed from the very beginning, we are more empowered as a nation if we are protecting our wealth, that we're not subject to whatever the government is going to do to us by changing the value of our money. If we're not protected, we have nothing to stand on. I think the more Americans that own gold and silver coins, the better off we all are. So spread the word. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell your family members. Everybody should have a little bit of gold and silver coinage as a portion of their wealth.
Awesome. For Fred, this is Dr. Dean, BRAVEtv. We'll see everybody in After Dark tonight, but have an amazing, amazing day. Take care. Bye-bye.